of human activities in the last 150 years or so in the industrial era due to burning of fossil fuels and emission of greenhouse gases, which are beyond the ability of Earth to absorb, which is resulting in an accumulation of these gases in the atmosphere, and which in turn is leading to significant negative impacts not only for humankind but practically for all life on Earth. And therefore, countries around the world decided that this is a problem that needs to be tackled, and they came together in the mid-90s to form what is called as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. And since then, they've been having annual meetings, which are called the Conference of Parties, or COPs, since then. And the latest COP, which took place in December 2015, was the 21st COP, which took place in Paris. And today's discussion is essentially going to revolve around the Paris Agreement and its implications for the world in general, and much more of interest to all of us here, what it means for India and its development in future. So a few words on what the Paris Agreement itself was about, because that is something that maybe not all of you are very familiar with. So at COP21, 195 countries, pretty much an unprecedented number of countries, came together and signed a common agreement on how the world will fight climate change in the coming years and decades. And as part of this, they agreed to a few things, and the result of the Paris Agreement has been largely hailed. Not everybody, of course, is extremely happy with it, but most of the world leaders have been very happy with it. So the President of France, François Hollande, said it is an ambitious, binding and universal agreement. The Secretary General of United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, has said that it is a resounding success of multilateralism, while Christiana Figueres, who is the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, felt that we made history together at Paris. So obviously, there are a lot of people who are very happy about what came out of Paris. So what actually was agreed to at Paris that these people are all so happy about? So firstly, countries have come together to agree that we should all try and limit the rise of global temperatures to a maximum of 2 degrees centigrade above what it was in the pre-industrial era, and if possible try and limit this rise to actually 1.5 degrees centigrade. And they also said that the world as a whole should reach peak emissions as soon as possible, which means that the greenhouse gas emissions per year should peak as soon as possible. And once it peaks, there should be an attempt to reduce it drastically very soon after that. And in order to achieve these lofty goals, they also agreed on some measures. And the measures were that countries are expected to periodically come up and state what is it that they are individually going to do to combat this problem of climate change. And the starting point for this would be what many countries have already submitted, called the Intended Nationally Determined Contributions, or INDCs. So these are commitments that countries have already said that we are going to take some steps to mitigate climate change in the next 15 years. There was also some agreement on how climate finance contributions will come, because combating climate change is something that's going to require a lot of money for many countries, especially the poorer countries. So there was some discussion on the kind of finance arrangements that can take place, and what kind of finance contributions can come from which countries. So there was agreement that developed countries will contribute to addressing this problem, while developing countries are encouraged to make voluntary contributions to address the problem. There have been proposals to also slowly shall we say, take this whole measure forward. So it's not a one-time commitment. So there are going to be protocols developed to ensure that countries regularly report their emissions, that there are going to be regular what are called as stock takes. Every 5 years, the world will take stock of what has been happening in terms of what is the current carbon emissions like and what can be done about it. And there have also been statements about dealing with what is called as adaptation to climate change, because climate change impacts are already seen around the world, and one needs to also adapt and make the world more resilient to climate change as it takes place before we are able to deal with it. So this is the sum and substance of what was agreed at Paris. But fundamentally, I guess it's fair to say, and I hope the panelists will agree, that Paris effectively sealed the deal on a changed international architecture for international climate regime. Previous regimes was much more what is called as a top-down regime, where there was an attempt to decide what countries will do for to combat climate change. That has now changed to what is more of a bottom-up approach, where each country decides what it wants to do, and then you try to add it all up and see where it goes. And the second big change that the Paris Agreement has brought about is a dissolution of, in the earlier regime, which is essentially governed by the Kyoto Protocol, there was this notion of an Annex 1 countries and all other countries. So Annex 1 countries were the developed countries who had to take action, while other countries were countries that did not have to take any action. So this difference has now been dissolved. There is still in the text of the Paris Agreement, there's still a differentiation between developed countries and developing countries, but the word Annex 1 does not exist anymore. So the definition of developed and developing will evolve over time. And of course, this agreement has a lot of significance for India, because it is going to determine what kind of development choices we as a country have. India is a signatory to this agreement, so it will be expected to abide by it. And as a large and growing country, it will also be, there will be increasing pressure on India to perhaps take more and more actions to help fight climate change. At the same time, we are a large and poor country. We have a large coastline. We have a predominantly monsoon-dependent agriculture, and we also therefore are going to kind of face the brunt of climate change significantly as a country. So it's also in our interest to ensure that climate impacts are reduced as soon as well as possible. Another way of looking at this whole problem of how much action should India take, what is climate change going to mean for India, is that this perhaps you can look at it as an opportunity for India to essentially chart a new development pathway and perhaps take a world leadership in terms of telling the world how sustainable and equitable development can take place, and also without destroying the earth and the resources within it. Of course, this is something much easier said than done. I can sit on this chair and say this, but it's much harder to figure out what exactly the measure should be to actually achieve this kind of a sustainable development pathway. Before I understand, by the way, that Pune being a very intellectually active and society and the city, there are about 3 events on climate change and post-Paris discussions happening in about 10 days. There was one earlier this week. Today we are having this panel discussion, and there's one discussion next week that's going to happen. So hopefully we are all part of this churning process that's happening in the country in terms of trying to understand what this means and where this is all going to lead us. And to do that, we have an excellent panel today, and it's my pleasure to introduce them to you. So firstly, we have Chandra Bhushan, who is the Deputy Director General of the Center for Science and Environment, which is based in New Delhi. He has been working in the field of environment and development for about 20 years and has a wide range of interests, which spans all the way from industrial pollution, energy policy, climate change, food safety, subcontinental water crisis, and political economy of natural resource extraction. He has been a member of various national committees and has contributed to various policy processes and has authored or co-authored more than 15 books. Next to him is Navroz Dubash. He is Senior Fellow and Coordinator of the Climate Initiative at the Center for Policy Research, and his interests include climate change policy and governance, the regulatory state in the developing world, and the role of civil society in environmental governance. He has been a lead author for the International Panel on Climate Change, which is the body set up by the UNEP to assess climate change and its current and potential impacts. He has also served on various national committees on energy policy and is also on the editorial boards of several international journals. In 2015, he was conferred the 12th T.N. Khoshu Memorial Award in recognition of all his work related to climate policy. And to the extreme left is Sharat Chandra Lele, who is Senior Fellow, Program Leader, Climate Change, and Convener of the Center for Environment and Development at the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, or ATRE, which is based out of Bangalore. He specializes in interdisciplinary research on institutional, economic, and ecological aspects of forestry and water management, and also issues in sustainability and development. Sharad also serves on the editorial boards of many reputed journals and is currently also the president of the Indian Society for Ecological Economics. He has been part of various government committees and closely engages with civil society groups through research action partnerships, and has also published many papers and authored and edited various books and book chapters. So with that excellent panel that we have here today, what I would suggest is that I would request each of you to make opening remarks of about, let's say, 5 minutes each, addressing 2 overarching questions. The first dealing with what the Paris Agreement means for the world in general, and the second, I hope, which will be the greater focus, is what it means for India and what implications it has for India. And based on your opening remarks, then we can dive deeper into much more, let's say, the threads of the conversation and dive deeper into the issues as they go along. So, CB, may I request you to go first, then Navroz, then Sharad, in that order?
Thank you, Ashok. You will have to give me 2 minutes more.
Sure.
You know, I need to take 2 minutes because want to talk about a little bit about Girish. You know, somehow good people die young, and Anil Agarwal, the founder of Center for Science and Environment, died very young, and I had the fortune of meeting Girish, working with him, interacting with him, not so much as all of you, but at times. I just want to say something which Anil told me before he died. There was a big meeting at Center for Science and Environment, and it was the last meeting that Anil Agarwal came for. And he knew that he was dying. He was suffering from cancer for 10 years, and he said something which I always remember. He said that in India, people worship hero and heroines, not institutions. And he said, I would like to be remembered not as Anil Agarwal, but as someone who started Center for Science and Environment. And so if you want to remember me, make sure that Center for Science and Environment flourishes. And I think at this platform, I'll take this opportunity to say the best way to remember Girish is to make sure that Prayas goes miles ahead. Okay, I think that's something that is the best way to remember him.
Thank you.
Because this country desperately needs institutions. Okay, we start institutions, but once the leader goes, the institution collapses. That shouldn't happen. So my 2 minutes gone. Let me come back to Paris. I've written. I was at Paris. I've written about it. I differ significantly from the opinion that is largely there, universal opinion that Paris was a success, that the agreement arrived was successful, because I think we need to look at the benchmarks to define success. What are the benchmarks that you will use to say this agreement is successful? Now let's take the benchmark of, and I was just noting down the benchmark that you said, let's take the benchmark of ambition. And it has been hailed universally that the target of 1.5 to 2 degrees is the hallmark of Paris agreement. Now, what does 1.5 degrees target means? It's very important to understand. 1.5 degree target means that by 2035, the fossil fuel economy should vanish. That's what it is. Because the one understanding that climate scientists have given us is that for a temperature target, there is a defined carbon budget, plus minus certain percentage. Now, when you say that I want to meet 1.5 degree temperature target, we are talking about a carbon budget of anywhere between 450 to 800 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions from 2010 to 2100, 90 years period. Okay? Our current emissions are about 50 to plus 50 billion tons every year right now. So 1.5 degree carbon budget is equal to about 8 years to 16 years of our current emissions. Okay. Now all the projection shows that by 2030 there is no chance that the world is going to peak. The peaking of emissions that Paris Agreement talked about is not going to happen. In fact, there will be a reduction in rate of growth of emissions, but emissions in absolute terms will keep increasing. So 1.5 degree is in rear view mirror. We are actually looking minimum to 2 degrees, and if we don't act now, we are looking at 3 degrees. So it is scientifically fraud, let me use this word, to say that 1.5 degree is possible in current energy economic model that the world is following. Okay. And therefore, all the negotiators who came out from that meeting signing Paris Agreement knew that they were bluffing. Okay. So that's point number one. So as far as ambition is concerned, Paris Climate Agreement, ambition, even unambitiousness would be a polite word to describe it. Okay. Now let's come to equity. Fairness, equity, common but differentiated responsibilities. These are the terms that are used to define environment justice, climate justice. Okay. Paris Agreement ensures that the historical responsibility of developed country is in dustbin of history. Okay. That's what they have made sure. It was an agreement designed to bypass US Congress. That was the fundamental principle of designing this agreement. How do we bypass US Congress? Everything was done to bypass US Congress, because the general feeling was that if we have an agreement that has to go and get ratified by the US Senate, this agreement will never be ratified. And I cannot believe that of the 195 countries that came there, the agreement was designed to suit one country and one institution within one country. That is the legislatures of the United States of America. Okay. Now, if from all equity and differentiation angle, it is a bottom-up, self-differentiated, non-legally binding agreement, where the agreement essentially say, do ever what you want to do, just report. That's what the agreement is. Okay. And I have not seen in history of the world of environmental regulation any self-regulatory mechanism that says that. You know, there's a limit to self-regulation. We all understand that. But this is self-regulation turned on its head. Okay. So let me in the end say that this is not an agreement that is going to meet even 2 degrees target. This is an agreement of convenience where everyone had to do nothing, therefore everyone agreed. Okay. And only the time will say what to do, but I believe that there's enough opportunity for us to go back, look at it, how do we strengthen it, because this agreement is not going to save us. Thank you.
Thanks, CV. Now, Rose, I know you have somewhat different opinions from CV, so it'll be good to hear your perspective on some of these things.
Presumably this wasn't just an accident of the, but partly due to the way the panel was constructed. Let me actually start by agreeing with Chandrabhushan on 2 things, because actually there is a lot that I think we agree on that lies a little bit below the surface. The first actually has to do with Girish, and I just want to add my voice to his, which says that institutions are really important. And let me also say that as somebody who's been privileged to be around Prayas friends for many years, I want to say to all of you here that I think you're actually on your way, very much so, to enhancing and strengthening Prayas as an institution. And I've been privileged to be associated not just with Girish, but with Prayas as you'll continue on your journey. But I very much support the sentiment, and I'm really, really happy to be here. So that is an agreement that that is perhaps expected. But the other agreement that is a little bit less expected is on the 1.5. I agree with Chandrabhushan. This 1.5 business was just actually a cynical ploy. It allowed a lot of countries, and let me just sort of expand on that. So in the second week of Paris, there was a so-called coalition of the ambitious who came along and said, 2 degrees isn't good enough, it has to be 1.5 degrees. A lot of countries that had the moral high ground sort of played very clever politics and got this group of countries together. They came up with the 1.5 degree number, but nothing changed in terms of the actual pledges that countries put on the table. And so, as CB nicely explained with regard to the carbon budget, it makes it highly unlikely that will be met. It's just allowed these countries to cover themselves in this mantle of being ambitious for a short amount of time, and it was a disturbing aspect of the agreement as far as I'm concerned. Now, moving on from there, you know, this is a conversation that has been going on for a while, and I think that the benchmarks of success or failure have to be constructed in a way that allows us to have a productive conversation about what we do globally to address this and what India's contribution should be. So one of the things that people who take the view that Chandrabhushan takes don't often ask or answer is what feasibly they would like to see otherwise. Right? Now, if we could have an agreement that in fact told the US, you have to cut back your emissions by 0 tomorrow, told Western Europe, you've had your day, you need to vacate carbon space for us, and it had a prayer of being implemented, I would be the first to applaud. But we live in a world where nation states decide things on the base, in most cases, in the base of democratic politics of various sorts. And in that context, how do we address this challenging global collective action problem? And it doesn't serve us to portray the problem as a caricature. It's not a caricature. It's a very politically challenging problem that for 15 years people have tried to argue about. I want to make one small corrective statement to Ashok in this context. Kyoto was not really top-down.
Okay.
Kyoto was actually a bunch of European countries and a small, the Annex 1 countries, sitting down and saying, well, you know, if we look at what we can do at home, we can come up with 5.2% reduction from 1990 levels on average. That was not anything that was determined by science. It was actually a bottom-up number. It was just constructed in a larger top-down framing. So what we have here is not such a violent departure, actually. What you have here is, let me say why the top-down story, which would have been the way to do it. If you were an engineer and you're designing how you do a Paris Agreement, you would start by saying, here's the goal, here's what you want to do, now we have to divide up the pie, and everybody go off and do what you want to do. That is how an engineer would think about it, right? Most legislatures are not full of engineers, except the Chinese, which is one reason why they've actually played this very well. For that to work, implicitly, every country in the world has to say, we are willing to make climate change the #1 political issue on our agenda, so that everything else in our economy is determined by our global commitment to address climate change, our share of the climate budget, as CSE would divide it up. That's not going to happen, because no country, including India, is willing to say climate change, we're willing to accept climate change as a binding constraint on our economy. That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen in India, it's not going to happen in the US. In the US, half of the politics doesn't even accept that this is a problem, right? In that context, what do we do? Because if we stand on principle, the people who we sacrifice to our principle are the most vulnerable people in India and elsewhere. We have to find a solution past this. So what actually happens in every national context, a country says, here's what we think we can do, given our needs for energy, given our need to win votes, given where our economy is, and even if you have a top-down story, that is still how those targets would be decided. There is no other way to decide targets except on the way in which national politics will determine those targets. What the Paris Agreement says is, okay guys, we recognize that's how it works. That's how it works. Given that, how do we make this work faster and speed things up? How do we create a virtuous cycle, ideally, of where countries put, you know, something quite serious on the table, and then when they see another country has put something serious on the table, after 5 years they see countries are implementing it, they say, okay, we're not being taken for fools, maybe it's okay to put something slightly more serious on the table. That is the mental construction of the Paris Agreement. And it's not, and so it's not, my argument would be, of course it's not perfect. Of course it doesn't guarantee that we'll get to 2 degrees. But you know what? The pledges that are on the table, the first round of Copenhagen pledges got us to around 3.74 degrees. This round of pledges got us to 3 degrees. It's still nowhere near 2. There's supposed to be another round of pledges based on this global stocktake, and there are mechanisms to encourage countries to do more, so-called ratchet mechanisms. Every country's national commitment is going to be subject to a technical expert review. Now, we've all been part of some of the informal discussions with India. India is thinking very hard about how to do this, given that there's going to be a technical expert review. I know that in other countries there has been similar national processes. In South Africa, they've had a public consultation process. In Brazil, they put something in the public domain for 6 months. The point is, what Paris does is create political spaces for debate and discussion in national political economies, which is where these discussions should be happening. And it pushes them in the direction of more aggressive action. Could this spiral reverse? Of course it could. But you're building a machine that is trying to get the direction of travel right and accelerate it. In that sense, there is something hopeful here for Paris. 1 minute on, I had to explain this, but 1 minute on India, and we'll spend much more time on India and the rest of it. So, from an Indian point of view, what do we win and what do we lose? I think the 1.5 degrees, bad idea, because it risks putting more pressure on India. I've agreed here. On common but differentiated responsibility, historic responsibilities, and so on and so forth, what the Paris Agreement does is actually it doesn't get rid of differentiation entirely. It blurs the boundaries. And that's also a political compromise, right? So it says developed countries have to take the lead, and developing countries who wish to can take measures of various sorts. And similarly with financing. So it doesn't put direct pressure on a country like India. It might open the door to indirect pressure. That's very much the case, right? I agree with that. But India then has to be confident in how we play this game. But it doesn't completely eradicate that distinction. Also, India is definitely among the larger emerging economies is in a very different place. And I think let me just make a point of criticism of our government. We've played our hand very badly in the last 5 years. We want to be part of the big kids club. We want to be with China and so on and so forth. We are not China. We are not South Africa. We are not Brazil, right? So we definitely need this protection in a sense. But a lot of other emerging economies, countries like Singapore, countries like South Korea, their GDP levels, their per capita emission levels are now at the level of some of the European countries. So the argument goes, why should they continue to be in this other club? And that's not a completely an argument that has zero merit. So that blurring of the lines is again a political accommodation. And I think that India has reasonably protected its interests with regard to accessing energy in the future. The other thing that we've done is, as Ashok said, we often forget this in India. We're a deeply vulnerable country. It would be a really bad idea if there was no agreement. If instead of 3.7, it went to 4.7 or 5, or as it currently stands, around 3. We need to see global action on climate change, not just because we want to preserve our rights to energy, but because we're a vulnerable country. So at least it gives us something to work with. So Paris is not a solution by itself. Paris builds a machine that we now have to use, and we have to use it in our national political economies, and we have to use it strategically in our playing in the international arena.
Thanks, Nowroz. Sharad.
I can say that I am probably the person on the stage who met Girish first amongst all of the people on the stage, and perhaps many of the people here in the audience, because I met him much before he had ever had thought of Prayas. I met him in 1982 when he joined IIT Bombay. He happened to be in my hostel and eventually in my wing. And so I knew him really in a very different avatar. I knew him as somebody interested in mountaineering, somebody really enthusiastic about a variety of such activities that we all did in IIT Bombay. Not so much with what we go there for officially, which is studies and learning engineering and all this kind of stuff. So we really hung out together on or overlapped in other parts of the IIT activities. And later on, I found after a few years when I had myself deviated into environmental studies, then I found that Girish himself had also taken a similar track and gone into energy policy, possibly triggered by the whole Enron episode, which was a very significant event here in Maharashtra. So our paths crossed again much more now in our fields of actual interest in our work and so on and so forth. And I've known Girish in that avatar again for a very long time. And unfortunately, I missed the last few, the first 3 Girish Sant memorial events, which I feel very guilty about for a variety of reasons. I was not able to make it. So I'll take the occasion to just endorse what Chandrabhushan and Nowroz have already said, both in terms of Girish and in terms of Prayas's work after Girish. And I'm very confident that Prayas will continue to do what Girish had hoped Prayas would do, and much beyond that. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. But I would like to sort of stand up and give my friend Girish a big hug, just because, as I said, I remember him all the time when I think of a variety of things that we had common interests in, including, of course, the question of public policy in a variety of contexts. Coming to the topic that we are debating this evening to some extent, I think the question of 1.5 degrees being a sort of a vacuous agreement or a statement in the agreement, I think it's a fairly obvious point. I'm also very glad that Nowroz pointed out or clarified the issue of top-down versus bottom-up. I think I really would like to thank you for that. I'm not an expert or a very good student of the international climate politics side of the story. My work has been much more domestic, and I'm a very reluctant climate change person. And I'll explain later on why that is the case. But I have been struggling with this language of top-down versus bottom-up. From whatever I know of collective action theory, which we use also in the forestry and other kinds of common pool resource contexts, there is no concept of top-down. I think it happens because the climate change field has been dominated by engineers, if I may say so, for a long time. So we think maybe in a top-down manner. But collective action people will tell you that there's nothing like top-down. You have a common pool problem, you need people to come together and agree upon something. And of course, there might be a big player who's driving the whole process, like the zamindars who would drive the irrigation tank cleanups in medieval India. So you might have a zamindar, but here you have a zamindar who is the least interested in cleaning up that particular tank, and we know who we are talking about. So then it's really the non-zamindars who are struggling to get the zamindar ki bhai aap bhi aiye aur thoda kuch kariye, reduce your the dirt that you're putting into that common pool resource. So in that context, I think it's absolutely right that there is nothing like top-down. Any agreement that we would have to be bottom-up to a significant extent. You might have the bigger players bullying the smaller players to some extent. You might have the smaller players in this context trying to put some moral pressure on the bigger players. They don't have anything else to bring to the table, really. I mean, what do the island states have to offer in terms of what they will do? They are mostly looking there for some kind of hope that maybe they will not go down in the sea level rise. So the position of countries like India is the most difficult, because this is this peculiar collective action situation where, as Navroz said, half of the US legislature say that this is not even a problem they're interested in. So they are a zamindar who is not even looking at that common pool resource as something that needs to be cleaned up. So our position really in the middle, where we're going to get hit significantly by climate change, and yet we are not really the biggest contributors. We never were the biggest contributors. Trying to somehow cajole and coax various countries to maybe come to the table, it's a very difficult ball game. So whether we achieved anything significant at Paris, really that lens, whether you take on a more idealistic position, say what we should have achieved, or what ideally we would want a Paris-like agreement to get us, vis-a-vis, a more realpolitik position that I think Navroz is taking, saying, look guys, this is not the only game in town. There are so many things that are going on in these countries, and including our own country. I mean, there's no sign that our country, whether under the current dispensation or the previous dispensation, really took environmental issues seriously. It was mostly going to these meetings because you don't want some very, very oppressive agreement to come and be pushed down our throats. It was a very defensive kind of, approach to international climate negotiations. It wasn't about, this is an opportunity for us to change what we do at home. No, not at all. It was about how can we protect our business as usual as much as possible, in these crazy negotiations about climate change, which is never our problem to begin with. So that has been a very, different approach. So I think whether we achieved certainly we didn't achieve what we would have liked to achieve in Paris. And here the we is not the Indian government, but really us in this room. Could we have achieved more given the realpolitik of the situation? I think that's a very tough call to make. I think what we will see is the question, the examples that Navroz gave about Paris making it possible to start dialogues within countries about how are we going to ratchet up this process, or how are we going to even meet that technical scrutiny. To me, the test of Paris will be not whether these dialogues or these discussions are happening in Brazil or India or South Africa. The test of it is whether there is an iota of this discussion happening in the US or in Canada or some of these countries which have been the most recalcitrant in terms of making serious commitments. So I think that's really going to be our test. And let us maybe all pray and hope that Bernie Sanders becomes the next president. Then maybe there's a chance that I mean, it's a really pathetic state of affairs that all the internal politics of one country dominates all the discussion in terms. But it is because one of the biggest emitters, direct and indirect, given that half of probably what China is producing is actually should be debited to the US account, since it's all being consumed in the US. So it's really the biggest emitter in the world, and therefore its politics matters incredibly more than anybody else's politics. So I think the jury is still out on whether the Paris Accord will lead to a ratcheting up. That's the positive or hopeful interpretation. It's possible that it may not, and it may very well backfire on us, because we have not just made our own commitment. I think there I would differ with Navroz a little bit, and I'm sure he would agree with this nuance that given this peculiar nature where not everybody is even seeing it in their interest to do something about this common pool problem, it's a case of players who are caught in the middle, like India or some others who are going to get hurt the most, going that extra mile or two, that extra step or two, to make commitments that are really pushing them ourselves, in order to sort of bend and grease the wheels to make maybe the bigger players do something. It's clearly an example of that, where we have, I think, gone overboard in terms of making commitments in order to get these other guys on board. And that therefore it could very easily backfire, because they have the power to then turn the searchlight of technical scrutiny on us. We have very little power to turn that technical scrutiny on them and get them to really respond even to to see whether their existing commitments are being met or not. So I think we have to see this as a very tricky game that we are involved in, and it could very easily backfire. I will just add one last sentence, which is that Chandrabhushan rightly started with the question of ambition, whether the Paris Agreement was ambitious enough, also whether it was equitable enough or equitable at all. I would add a third element, and that's a very domestic or inward-looking element, which is the danger side of the story. Because what is reflected in the global arena in terms of inequities of who's responsible, who's rich, who's poor, who's the biggest environmental delinquent, and who's not, is also reflected within the country. So whatever INDCs we put out are riding on top of internal inequities in terms of access to development and impacts of INDC type commitments. And I think, so there's a third element, which is the danger element. Is the Paris Accord or the INDCs that India made in the Paris Accord dangerous or safe in terms of what it will do to people in our country? And I'll just come back to that maybe in the second round when we focus more on the Indian question.
Okay, thanks. So I think based on the initial remarks, it's very clear that Paris does not measure up if you just looked at it in terms of ambition, but as Navroz pointed out, from a realpolitik point of view and from what was possible, maybe this is a good starting point, and that's more a statement of hope, and we might move forward from here. But given that Paris is a reality, whether we like it or not, is now, Paris itself is in our rear view mirror. 1.5 is in our rear view mirror, Paris is also in our rear view mirror. So Paris is a reality now. So given the reality of Paris, what is it that India can do in order to achieve whatever developmental goals and ambitions it has, and also in terms of trying to do it as a responsible citizen of the world in a sustainable manner, and of course taking care of the question that Sharad at the end pointed out is a very, very important question in terms of its own internal problems. It's not that solving climate change, as Navroz said earlier, solving climate change is not India's primary problem. It also is a question of internal equity, internal development, and maybe Sharad, I'll begin with you to get your thoughts on some of these issues in terms of you've been involved. I know that you believe that India anyway has so many environmental problems that it needs to deal with. Climate change is one more dimension to this. So your thoughts on how India can go about addressing problems in whatever sectors that you want to take a shot at: agriculture, water, forestry.
Okay. So maybe I'd like to start by slightly sort of an overview statement, which is that the idea that you initially flagged, climate change is an opportunity. Domestically, for us environmentalists today, I would rationalize my engagement with the climate change question not because we are responsible for the problem to begin with, not because even today we have a huge role to play. We are at 5% of emitters. We could shut down our emissions instantaneously and make no impact really on this thing, except perhaps again greasing the wheels in terms of maybe putting moral pressure on others to do something. But really we are a small player in terms of even our current contribution. So the reason to engage perhaps is with respect to adaptation, and I'll come to that in more detail, but really the opportunity that it affords for us to turn a searchlight on what we are doing in terms of sustainable development in this country. And that's been a journey for many environmentalists to actually get to this point of looking at this as an opportunity, because certainly for me personally, initially it was like, let us not really engage with this question because it comes with a lot of baggage that will only disrupt our internal negotiation within our country between those who would like to go with business as usual, 9% GDP growth and all industrialization at a very fast pace, vis-a-vis those who have been talking about sustainable and equitable development for quite some time. So let me say that what climate change brings to the table, which is positive for environmentalists, is the opportunity to look at some of the core issues that create environmental problems to begin with. That is the carbon footprint. Even if it's small in global terms, we are at 2, and the average is much higher, and then the US is much further ahead. But we have latched on to that trajectory. We would, in a conventional sense, we would like to be where the US is eventually, or somewhere there in that range. And so what this affords for us environmentalists is an opportunity to ask the question, is that really where you want to be? Is that really where you can ever be? And if so, at what cost and whose cost? And the reason why climate change affords us that option, perhaps much more clearly than earlier environmental efforts on, say, for example, the anti big dam movement around Narmada, or the question of forest rights, the question of agriculture and so on, different movements in different sectors, is that it really hits at the core, which is that the conventional model of development is a fossil fuel based model of development. And if you follow that path, that's where you're going to end up. What it allows us to do is really look at carbon footprint as an indicator of the larger set of environmental problems that we create. While our carbon footprint may be small, in the regional environmental space that we have in the South Asian context, our regional environmental footprint is very large. The number of people displaced by dams, the number of people displaced under mining projects, the number of livelihoods destroyed by various kinds of developmental activities is huge. We are talking of millions and millions of people. The kind of biodiversity loss that we have seen over the last 50 years is phenomenal for a region which is known as a global biodiversity hotspot. So from a variety of environmental angles, the current model of development itself is a problem, and the carbon footprint, to the extent that it is correlated with other regional environmental footprints, is a nice way, a clean way of getting at this question of what kind of development are we really aspiring for. So that's the reason to engage with this question as far as I'm concerned from a domestic perspective. But then we see that this opportunity, that this climate change becoming the biggest environmental problem or the mother of environmental problems as the Western world would like us to believe, it's a very tricky, again, it's a double-edged sword. So in the urban industrial sector, as I said, definitely it affords us an opportunity to maybe deviate from that conventional pathway into a very different path of development. In the adaptation context, I would like to say it's a more tricky business, because climate change today is being portrayed as the only thing that agriculture, water and other health and other sectors need to be responding to. All the funding today comes in with the label of climate change. What it is doing is distracting us, the best of us, from understanding that climate change is just an add-on to an existing set of problems. And if you just look at the water sector, I'm sure all of you would agree with me, you just need to look around at the Mula-Mutha river or the Ganga, or back in Bangalore, the Arkavati and the Kaveri, that our handling of the water question in India has been a very poor job, resulting in depletion, in pollution, and in unfair allocation between sectors, between regions, between different kinds of rich and poor users and so on. So our water sector situation is a classic example of not being nowhere near the goal of sustainable and equitable development. Climate change is only going to complicate the story, but it may go both ways, because you are seeing regions where rainfall intensities may increase, quantum of rainfall may increase. In the Himalayan context, perhaps the melting of the Himalayan glaciers could very dramatically change the regime of these rivers, but we have actually already changed the regimes dramatically. If you look at the Gangetic Basin today, it's nowhere near natural flows. So if we just think of the Gangetic Basin as having natural flows and then do a climate hydrological model and tweak the climate variables and look for the changes out there, which is what a lot of climate hydrology people are doing, it is completely untenable science, because we have intervened in the flows in the Ganga or any other major river basin in this country at such a phenomenal scale that really it is the Anthropocene. We have really changed the face of these river basins in such a dramatic way already that climate change could be just an additional complication on that. And we have not understood ways of converting these changes in these river basins into any kind of sustainable and equitable allocation of water resources and its use. So just taking that one example, I would like to say that the adaptation question is complicated, and if we look at climate change as the mother of environmental problems, and therefore climate adaptation as the thing we should focus on, and climate finance as the way to do it, I think we would be doing ourselves a very big disservice. And so I would always push for engaging with climate finance or the question of adaptation through the lens of multiple stressors and multiple concerns. We have multiple concerns in this area. It's not just resilience to climate, and climate is not the only stressor. There are many other stressors already on our socio-environmental systems, and we need to be building ways of governing these systems and using these systems that would also then include the climate risk, but perhaps not as the first thing at all. Groundwater aquifers are already depleted, rivers are already polluted. So let's fix them, and maybe in the process we will also become climate resilient anyway. So I think that's the message as far as adaptation is concerned. Sorry, the last point would be about the forest sector. So whereas in the urban industrial sector, climate change is definitely an opportunity for us to reorient. In the adaptation sector, maybe, maybe not. Maybe there are funds, if you use them cleverly, give the tag of climate adaptation, but do really what we should be doing, which is looking at it as a multiple stressor, multiple concern problem, maybe. In the forest sector, definitely not. Climate change is not an opportunity, it's a threat. And what I mean by there is that the Paris Agreement and the INDCs that India has put forth are a threat. I'm not saying climate change won't affect the forest sector biophysically. I'm talking about the political agreement in Paris and the INDCs that we have put up. If you look at the INDCs, it talks about 100 million tons of carbon sequestration every year is the goal of the Indian government. And it's going to be achieving that goal through a sort of business as usual strategy in the forest sector in terms of afforestation programs and increasing the density of trees in existing forested areas. And it's a completely forester driven, IFS people, folks driven, blind to the realities of the last 50 years in terms of the kind of forest conflicts we've had. And maybe I'll stop here and elaborate, later on if there is time to elaborate.
Yeah. Navroz, I think Sharad's final things are very close to the kind of things you're talking about, multiple stressors and multiple reasons. So do you want to share your thoughts on?
Yeah, just like to pick up where Sharad left off. The fact that the way in which you think about how climate change, whether it's an opportunity or threat, and how it actually interacts with the kinds of, if you like, mainstream development questions that I think fundamentally motivate, I'm guessing certainly all of us up here and many of you in the audience, it is actually case by case and nuanced, and there's no blanket statement that can be made, which I think the spirit of what Sharad was saying. So just reflecting on that also, whether India has in fact gone overboard. In the forest sector, I would completely agree they've gone overboard. In terms of the pledge, or the INDC as it's called in the parlance, if you look at the aggregate, what India has put on the table is reasonably safe, if you look at most of the numbers. The underlying point here is how you interpret any particular measure, whether it's in forest or energy and so on and so forth, depends on your understanding of these multiple stressors and these multiple objectives. So here there's an analytical question that some of us have been doing some work on, which is, say, if you look at any particular policy, one needs to understand what its implication is for all the things, all the goods you want to achieve, all the good things you want to achieve. So if it's an energy policy, maybe you want to look at access to energy, maybe you want to look at local environmental pollution that results. You want to also look at the global environmental pollution, that is the greenhouse gases. You may want to look at things like jobs. You may want to look at fiscal implications. And you actually need to analyze all of those things and not privilege climate change necessarily as the only thing you look at. That would ideally be the way to build these national pledges. And I'm hoping that in the future, we do that and we use that approach. Because if we use that approach, then I think this process can actually be an opportunity, and it would weed out some of the bad things like the forest component of the INDC. I just want to add just a brief point in reflection of the earlier comment in terms of what these pledges in this process look like. Paris is actually legally binding, but it's legally binding to these procedures. It's not legally binding with respect to outcomes. So it's an important nuance. So every country has to put these things on the table on a regular basis and report on them. So the question then is again how you use these opportunities. Just playing on that idea a little bit more in the energy sector. I think that in India we could use this whole process of putting together pledges, and energy is a very big part of the mitigation side of the climate question. We could use this process more productively than we used it last time around. India put together its INDC a little bit hastily, and the analysis was sort of still coming in at the last minute and so on. And now we have time to actually do something much more thorough in that multiple objective way that I talked about. And not just to position ourselves well in the international community, but because it could be used as a driver, as Sharad was suggesting, of domestic debates. So for example, urbanization. We have a big opportunity here to think about urbanization patterns in India. Some of the numbers suggest that the building stock in 2030, 2/3 of those buildings are yet to be built. So what is the nature of those buildings? Our public transport systems and generally our patterns of mobility in cities, we have an opportunity to avoid locking into very high fossil fuel based, high polluting sources of fuel. If we do that analysis right, I think we'll find that in a lot of cases, what in the parlance is called co-benefits, so the benefits that are both to development as well as to climate change, there is actually a lot of convergence, things that one would want to do anyway, such as better public transport systems, such as better zoning regulations to reduce the need for people to travel long distances to work. These are things that we probably want to go down the road of doing anyway. What does climate change do in this context? One thing it does is it harnesses some powerful ministries to having this conversation. So suddenly you have people in the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of External Affairs, these sorts of places asking questions about future development trajectories, instead of having people in Ministry of Environment trying to get everybody's attention. So that can be used in productive ways potentially. If it's backed by the kind of analysis which shows where you clearly have those co-benefits and you weed out some of the negatives, because there is a risk of, in a very unthoughtful way, some of these negative policies that actually may be constructed as being climate, as good from a climate point of view, but actually very bad in terms of other outcomes. You definitely want to weed those out. So to take this, so I guess where I'm coming down on this is, we need to do the analysis that allows us to use those opportunities better, and we also need to be strategic about the different actors coming into the game to make sure that they are armed with the right kind of analysis so that we can use this discursive opportunity to actually move towards development goals at the same time as we contribute in the climate context.
Thanks. CV, your thoughts on
Let me first of all, I was listening carefully. I need few minutes to clarify some of the issues that Navroz has raised. There is a bottom up in top down and there is top down in bottom up. It needs to be understood. There is nothing called as pure top down or pure bottom up.
Yeah.
Okay, that's first. And climate change is not only a common pool problem, it is also a property right issue, whether we like it or not. Okay? Carbon is a finite budget. It is available and every human being on earth has equal right on it. Okay? If we say 2 degrees, 1000 to 1400 billion tons is common property of the world. What right anyone has to misappropriate it? Okay? That is important to understand. Let's not make it a polite discussion. Okay? Climate change is difficult because it is related to economics. Okay? Yeah. Each and every country is finding it difficult to give ambitious pledge because they believe it is going to hit their economy. So at the end of the day, if you are going to solve climate change, you will have to reorient your economy in a given budget. Okay? And that budget is available to everyone. So it's a property right issue. Unless and until you resolve that property right issue, you are not going to have ambitious climate deal. It's as simple as that. Okay? Sarath works in forestry sector. Global experience of forestry sector is you give right to people, they manage forests much better than if you don't give right to people.
Yeah.
It's an issue with agriculture. You give right to land. Okay? So unless and until you resolve that property right issue in climate change, then it's all polite talk, frankly. Okay? There's nothing concrete coming out of that. So that's point number one. Even Kyoto, Navroz is right. At the end of the day, 20 countries sat together and said how much I can cut, 5.2%. But that was beginning of a process, okay, which had a combination of top down. Top down was, it was legally binding, there was a compliance mechanism, that was the top down, the targets were bottom up, okay. Over a period of time, we should have strengthened that process. Instead of strengthening that process, we have diluted that process. Now, what is so unique about climate change that we have to talk bottom up? Every other multilateral agreement in the world is top down, okay? Largely top down. World Trade Organization, will you call WTO, which is where all the economy is negotiated, a bottom up regime? It's a largely top down compliance driven regime. Montreal Protocol, the so called most successful environmental convention, is the most top down regime you can think about. Laws of sea, International Criminal Court. Think about any multilateral legislation, a multilateral agreement, they are largely top down. So what is so unique about climate change? is something I have never understood, nor anyone has given a correct answer to that. Okay, that's point number one I would like to put. As far as India is concerned, I think I do not buy that agreement that India, there should not be any limit on India. Okay, if I am demanding limit on the United States, then I must have limit on myself as well. Otherwise, what right I have to go and say you have limit, but I have no limits. Okay, and this appropriation of property right actually puts limit on India. Okay, if there is some sort of I'm not saying there will be a formula-like approach, but you will have to have some sort of limit on India as well. If there is limit on India, then we will have to do things differently in urbanization. Right now, there is no limit. In fact, our INDCs, frankly, from this podium, I will say, forestry target is going to make sure that we are going to have a lot of conflict in our forest area. We already have a guideline issued which says that we can hand over forest to private sector, guideline for handling over forest, and one of the objective is to meet climate goals of India. Okay, forestry sector you are going to increase conflict. As far as energy sector is concerned, the assumption is that we will be able to lower the solar price, but the fact is right now we have 80,000 megawatt of coal based power plant which is stranded. Okay, our plant load factor of coal sector is 50%. Electricity boards don't have money to buy electricity. So as far as this 300 gigawatt target by 2030 that we are talking about can only happen if we start shutting down coal. Okay, otherwise I don't think Indian market has so much energy demand to absorb an additional 300 gigawatt of solar and other renewable energy. Okay, so as I look at India's INDC as well, whether it is renewable energy or it is forestry, for example, there is no relation between improvement in emission intensity of GDP and renewable energy target. If I meet renewable energy target, if India meets a renewable energy target, then the emissions intensity improvement could be as high as 45%, whereas we have given a target of 33 to 35%. So it's a completely mismatched INDC. Completely agree with Navroz that they have not thought through it. They have given INDC. What are the opportunities for India? Let's look at climate opportunities for India. I think great opportunities. We are still building, and we are building mindlessly right now. There is an opportunity to be mindful. Okay, whether we are building the city of Pune, or we are going to build new cities, or we are going to improve urban areas. India is going to urbanize over the next few. We are going to continue urbanizing. And what should be the nature of urbanization will decide the sustainability of this country. Okay, that's the fundamental question. How do we urbanize? What should be our resource consumption pattern in urban areas? How should we get energy? How should we get water? How should we use land? What should be the character of our buildings? These are some of the issues. Climate change gives us an opportunity, okay, to redo these things much more better in a much more sustainable manner. Okay.
Thanks. I think the discussion is provoking a lot of questions already from the audience. I've collected a few and kept them here. There are a few more that I've not even collected yet. We'll try and address some of them as we go along. But I think, so essentially I see all of you, essentially you're looking at climate change as a lever or as an opportunity to address many problems which are significantly domestic. And of course, climate change itself is also both a domestic problem as well as an international problem. But given that, for example, I think a lot of focus has been there on the urban problems and opportunities there. Sharad has talked about forestry. What do you see as the significant challenges in terms of trying to find these solutions? We know that solutions exist out there, that India can identify these solutions, whether it's in terms of institutions that we have, the processes that we currently have in terms of working with these things, or what do you think we need to do differently? Because right now we have a certain system with a few ministries at the center doing some things, states are doing their own things, cities are doing their own things, with some small dotted lines connecting these various across a level as well as across different levels. So what do you think is a way out of this siloization, separation? Because I think this requires a very, very integrated, multidisciplinary approach to deal with many of these problems. None of these things can be dealt with easily. So what are your thoughts? Navroz, you want to go first?
Sure. Can I just take 30 seconds on a couple of things actually to agree with Chandrabhushan, but elaborate. I think it's important. Then I'll come to this question. I think we're simultaneously, the issue is climate change is simultaneously a global collective action problem, and it is simultaneously the aggregate of a bunch of disconnected national decisions. It has both those characters, which is why we keep flipping around between top-down and bottom-up, and it is actually a question of is it predominantly one or predominantly other. It's always a combination of both, and the question is what combination actually suits. So I think that's the most useful way to think about it, which I think is latent in what CB was also saying. On the multilateralism, just want to make one observation. We're operating in a very different global geopolitical world. We no longer have the US as dominant as it's been, the West in general as dominant as it's been. China is really flexing its muscles. The developing world, emerging economies are growing very fast. So actually, all the successful top-down multilateral agreements that CB mentioned happened in the 90s, in the first half of the 90s. There's been nothing since then, including in the WTO. So I think that's also an important contextual factor we should keep in mind. The world is just sort of changing, and that the politics accordingly change. Okay, enough on all that stuff. I've been thinking about this question of how we sort of try and not very successfully, I should add, but I've been thinking about it, how we have a more integrated way of decision making. And I think part of the problem actually rests in a slightly different description, which is that I don't think that we have a very deliberative, discursive style of decision making in India across many areas. So we don't actually have a decision-making framework which says we need to actually get information and perspectives from different places, including different ministries across sectors. We need to understand what the constraints are of implementation, whether it's from civil society, local organizations, or the private sector, and then develop policies that work given all these realities. That's what it would take to actually break those silos. So in a sense, the silos are a little bit an artifact of the way in which we make decisions, which is to say, okay, you take charge of this decision, that joint secretary in that ministry decides this, and then they're sort of treated as at the top of this pyramid, and they make a decision based on the information that's in front of them. Because they're part of the IS, they have to pretend that they're omniscient and actually have all the information in front of them, and they go ahead and make the decision. And then there's a game of adjustment that continues after that, because the decision doesn't take into account all the facts, all the perspectives, all the obstacles. So, and you see this in issues like energy. There's another chronic problem, which is frankly the lack of ongoing analysis and data. So in the energy sector, we don't have data that is robust, data that is continuously updated. Prayas has done some very nice work on this. We don't have an analysis body for energy. So for example, when we were putting together our climate INDC, what we really should have done, what we should have had, was a strategic planning process for energy around the country that said, here's the energy we need, here's what we expect for around coal, here's what we think the pollution, local air pollution implications are, and then built your climate implications on top of that, saying, here's what we need for energy, and the implications of it from a climate point of view are this. We didn't have that on which to build. And so we had to do some quick and dirty analysis to try and figure out what it means from a climate point of view. So I think one of the, and not to sort of entirely bash our bureaucrats, because they're operating in an extremely constrained environment where they don't have the analytical resources to call upon. There are often very, very few people working on very complex issues. So in this climate arena, for example, we did an analysis of all the people working on climate change across the government of India. And all we could come up with was somewhere around 40 to 60 people, sort of one person in a ministry here, one person in a ministry there. And they have to figure out what climate change implies for an area as complex as urban development. And it might be 1.5 people or 2 people doing this, right? So they're also operating under very challenging constraints. But I think an opening to discussing this question is to start moving towards a more deliberative style of discussion. And that's where I think academics, research organizations, the broader public, community organizations, if there's space for these various actors to become involved, I think that it will start breaking down the silos and leading to a more rich discussion. How exactly we do that? Well, that's another question that my panelists are probably better to address.
CB, I want to throw in one more thing into this question, because another, I don't know whether it's right to call it an institution, but another player at least, or another set of players in this whole game is of course the private sector. So if CB and Sharad, in your discussion, you also want to share your thoughts on what role private sector can play constructively or destructively or enabling or whatever, as in addition to of course all the other agencies that we've been talking about, because it's not only civil society and the government that's part of this game, but private sector is also a big part of the game, increasingly so. So what role do you see for them, and how do you see them playing? And yeah,
I think first of all, if there is a bottom up that I would like, is the bottom that should happen in this country on decision making on climate change. Okay, we rely too much on Delhi to decide climate change, and Delhi is absolutely not capable of deciding on climate change, frankly.
I'm glad we're having this event
Yeah,
in Pune.
I am in Delhi, but I'm quite happy to say that. Okay, I believe that at least to start with, capitals of the state should start thinking about climate change seriously. Think about the irony of the delegation that went to climate negotiations. There was lottery to decide 7 states that would go. Okay, so I do believe that going ahead, we need an institutional mechanism, both at the international level, where there is a deliberate engagement of state government and important ministries, agriculture to forestry, water, in what India should do internationally. Right now, it is just 2 ministries, External Affairs and Ministry of Environment and Forest, with a sprinkling from some others who decide what we should do. But for international deliberations, there has to be involvement of states, and states should exert their right. At the end of the day, what India decides at the multilateral forum will have to be implemented at the state level. Delhi is not going to come and implement it here, and therefore states should start exerting their right. They have right to be on that high table as well. At the state level, I believe that Sharad, as Sharad said, climate change is an additional signature over all the bad practices that we have. Okay, but that's also an opportunity, whether it is in water sector or land, agriculture, that the process that started in mid-70s actually, whether it was watershed management, rainwater harvesting, work on agriculture sector, we should continue that. We should start also planning about climate change, because I can tell you right now that some of the rainwater harvesting structure that we worked on are no more viable because of extreme weather events that is taking place. Yeah. So there is need for design change in some of the sustainable models that we have talked about. In Rajasthan, the rainwater harvesting structure that we have been researching for the past 30 years, we are finding that they are just not capable of handling extreme rainfall that is happening. Okay, so we will have to, in our sustainable practice, climate change signature will have to be included in our design and implementation at the local level. Similarly, coming back to private sector, I think private sector is having a field day in India, because they had a field day when CDM was there, Clean Development Mechanism. They made a lot of money. Okay, they now, Paris opens up carbon market as we have never seen in the past. Okay, we will have for the first time carbon credits being generated from forest. Okay, think about the price at which carbon credit will be sold from forest and from some of the poorest communities of the world. That's why I talked about conflict. But Paris now comes out with such wide-ranging carbon market. The design is going to be discussed. It will be a combination of CDM plus joint implementation in some different avatar that is going to happen. But carbon market is going to become very important. Okay, now private sector therefore has 2 options. One, that we actually use carbon market to do meaningful carbon reduction rather than creative carbon accounting. Okay, we end up doing a lot of creative carbon accounting in the end. In India, I very strongly believe that, I don't want to say this from platform, but I cannot think about anything else, but we will have to start a process in which climate impact assessment have to be included in major natural resource based projects, hydropower projects. We are building hydropower projects without deciding what is going to be the flow of the river. It doesn't get included in environmental impact assessment. okay, or for example a roadway project or a irrigation project that we are building, we will have to bring in some form climate impact assessment in our project design, not in the way we do environmental impact assessment right now, please don't get me wrong, okay. I don't want to even think about it, but in true sense, in project design and implementation, some sort of impact assessments will have to be done on what climate change's impact is going to be doing over the next 20 to 30 years, okay.
Thanks. Sharad?
So I'm glad you made that last.
Yes, I wanted to because I knew you were going to jump on me.
No, not jump on you, but I was going to say that to make an assessment of how climate change might influence the hydrological regime in the future, you need to know what the regime is in the present.
Right now, yeah.
But actually, and there are our technical side of our systems, whether it's the Central Water Commission or the state equivalent bodies in the state in the water sector, are a disaster. I mean, our understanding of the hydrological regimes of our existing rivers, forget climate change, is really so poor, and the understanding of the groundwater regime is even worse. So, and of course, the two organizations operate in silos. So, Central Groundwater Board sets definitions of sustainable use without thinking about the fact that groundwater is actually connected with surface water, and anything that you withdraw from ground, which is from the recharge, is actually something that you take away from the rivers in the form of base flow. So, even this fundamental understanding of the science is missing. They operate in silos, and then of course their data is really in a pathetic situation. So, there is a case to be made to bash the technocrats. There is, I think, actually Navroz was very kind when he said he won't bash the bureaucrats, because I'm going to actually bash the bureaucrats pretty heavily on this one, that there is a distinct difference in the context of the two sectors, I will say, forest and non-forest. If you look at the energy sector and ask the question, who is actually taking decisions about energy consumption and then even about energy generation, electricity generation in particular, right? Okay, historically, the generation side was sort of in the state's hands. State was the sole provider of big dams, coal thermal power, etc. That has also changed dramatically over the last few decades. There's a lot of decentralization, a lot of private sector players in the big plants, and certainly in the decentralized generation context. Industrial production is all pretty much now in the hands of private players, whether small or big. The forest sector is a completely different story. The forest sector is that one sector where the state continues to insist that it is the owner and it is the doer, and the INDC is so obviously completely blind to the fact that actually the Indian forest sector contains somewhere close to 100 million people living in and around forests. Depending upon how you calculate, forest dependent numbers go up to 250 million. So the actual producers or users of this forest resource are individual people, communities in a variety of ways, but the illusion that is created is that you have this nice separation. You have farmers on one side doing agriculture on private agricultural land, and then you have a forest land which is owned, managed, controlled, and produced on by the state. And the Forest Service, of course, wants to continue to build upon that illusion, continue to feed us with that illusion, because then they can write all these nice INDCs, they can then get money for national afforestation programs. The current budget for the national afforestation program is 37,000 crores. And it is amazing to see, every 5-year plan, the same story again and again. While you have got changes happening in forest policy, you've got changes then eventually percolating down into a Forest Rights Act in 2006, which is for the first time recognizing that there are people living in these forests. And they have been historically living in these forests, and they have a first charge on these forest resources, which they have been using at the sort of mercy of the state for so long. And that recognition is still not percolated in the forest officers in the bureaucracy. They have been fighting tooth and nail against recognizing this idea, that people live there, that people have a right. It is, and therefore they want to continue to portray this idea of a blank canvas which they control, a tree canvas that they control with no people in it. Of course, no wildlife and also in it either, no ecology in it. Because if you look at the state of forest report that the Forest Survey of India puts out every 2 years based on satellite imagery, and then you read the fine print, so the cover page says state of forest report, but the fine print says our definition of forest is tree cover. So all plantations are forest, whether it is a single species teak, single species eucalyptus, single species acacia, or even coconut, banana, areca nut, and what have you. All these, as long as they meet your minimum size requirement and canopy cover requirement, it is all forest. So this is the astonishing sort of sleight of hand that has been going on, and Anil Agarwal was one of the first people to write about it way back in 1997, if I'm not mistaken. And we've been following up on that same, trying to hammer away on this question that what are we talking about when we say forest? But even that little change has not happened in terms of how we report forest cover figures. And therefore, building upon this false notion of what is happening to our forests, because we define forests in this very funny manner, we then project saying we have increased forest cover and we can continue to do so and sequester 100 million tons of CO2 equivalent every year. And of course, there are no people in that whole equation. And no recognition that there's actually a historic act called the Forest Rights Act, which for the first time recognized the injustice done by taking forest rights away from people, and is trying to restore those rights back to them. That is the private sector. Actually, in the forest sector, that is the private sector that you should be thinking about. Not about, again, a state monopoly that can be handed over to companies on a piecemeal basis through MOUs and contracts, which has again been the vision of the corporate sector, that it's a blank canvas controlled by the state and then handed over as and when, as has happened in other sectors where this kind of a handover took place. So I think we really need to reorient ourselves when it comes to the forest sector. The forest bureaucracy is way ahead than the IAS in terms of their notions of omniscience and their notions of omnipotence and their knowledge proof approach to policy making. So their monitoring of forest cover is flawed. Their notions of where we want to go forward in terms of forest rights and the involvement of communities or local people who use these forests is completely closed door. And I've been on that Forest Rights Act review committee to look at the implementation of the act and finding there's absolutely no conversation that you can have with foresters, whether they come from this state or that state and so on. So I think we have a real problem in terms of the centralized services. We really need to actually tear them down. I personally believe that the IAS and the IFS services are part of the problem of governance in this country.
It's a very strong statement to end that question with. I have a whole section of other things that we could discuss, but I think we are running out of time, and I think we should do justice to some of the questions that have come from the audience. So we'll take maybe 4 or 5 of the questions from the audience, which I'll post to you, and you can choose whichever ones are comfortable answering whichever questions, and maybe we'll keep that as the last round of our discussions, because we're already, I think, close to 8 o'clock, which is more or less when we wanted to stop the end the program. So I think there's one set of questions around looking at the kind of pessimistic side of the picture, saying that, okay, let's say that we're not going to hit 2 degrees is also going to be difficult, as is very likely to be the case. So what really can India do, both in terms of adaptation and development, given the fact that things are going to get bad? I think there are about 2 or 3 people who kind of asked that. So can we even, as we discussed briefly earlier, look at this as an opportunity and India become a world leader in a different kind of a development pathway if something like this can happen, whether it's 2.5 degrees or 3 degrees, what kind of things can India do? So that's one. The second is in terms of the international politics of it, in particular the US, which is of course we all realize is the largest player. So what, essentially contextualizing it with the upcoming elections in the US. So what happens if the Congress is already Republican controlled, if we have a Republican president? What does it do to the international climate regime in terms of the international situation? Then we have some questions around energy, which talk about what are the realistic energy transition possibilities that exist. Going away from fossil fuels, is 100% renewables even possible? What does it mean? By when can we achieve it? What will it cost? And so on and so forth. And then there's this question about how can climate, the fundamental question in some sense really, I guess, is what this is asking, which is how can climate and environmental issues really become the political issues that people can talk about? Is green politics, green parties the way to go? What are the options there? So these are the 4 or 5 questions, and I don't know, each of you can choose which questions you want to answer, not want to answer.
Okay. I think we need to start preparing for beyond 2 degrees. I very strongly believe that. Okay. And in that case, for vulnerable communities, we have to start thinking about relief, insurance, mechanism that will build their resilience. So for example, for the last 2 years, we have been talking about universal agriculture insurance system in India. Okay, we have not what we wanted, but a much improved version of agricultural insurance that has been announced. And I want to say here very clearly that there is a clear recognition in people within the government working in the agricultural sector that climate change is on their head now. Okay, with what is happening in Marathwada area, or what happened in Rabi season last year in UP, where 72 out of 74 districts were devastated, or what is happening, we have a third consecutive years of Kharif drought in some or other part of the country. There is a general recognition that we are now feeling the brunt of climate change, and our existing relief mechanism that is in place, relief is absolutely not working, and we need a much more proactive insurance cum relief mechanism to be put in place. So one thing that we have to start thinking about, safety nets, that's what I call it. We will have to start building safety nets, because that is going to be the most important thing. So let me just, because other ideas will come on that issue. As far as US politics is concerned, I don't know how many of you know that even US Supreme Court has put on hold Obama's most ambitious climate clean power plan, and the entire US commitment is based on largely on what clean power plan is going to achieve. Now Supreme Court has stopped it. In March there is going to be ratification of Paris Agreement. The big question is, will US ratify, because till March Supreme Court is not going to vacate that order. The case is going to be fought in lower court right now. Okay. So the first thing is, will US ratify in March or not? Okay. If it ratifies, what will be the implications in the Congress, which is Republican dominated? Just forget about Donald Trump coming. Okay, that's the scariest part if he comes. Okay, just forget about that. But right now the biggest challenge is, will US ratify Paris Agreement or not? Okay, considering what is happening in the US right now with the Supreme Court of the US itself. Okay. The third is on energy. Is 100% renewable energy possible? I think there is no other way out. If not today, then tomorrow. We will have to start thinking about 100% renewable world. The renewable world is not going to be centralized and grid based world. The energy future for the world is going to be decentralized, distributed, where like you can have rainwater harvesting system, you can also have energy on the roof of your house and use it and distribute it. So the energy future is going to be very different. Till the time we are stuck with the idea of grid and centralized energy, 100% renewable will never happen. Okay, because 100% renewable is in contradiction to the grid, the very idea of grid. Okay, if think deeply, and you will find that we should start talking about obsolescence of grid now. Okay, there could be another discussion to discuss that topic. Is grid a idea of 19th century or 21st century? I believe grid is gone in 21st century if we are looking at 100% renewable energy future. Okay, and the last is, there is a chance of Green Party in India. There's already a registered Green Party in India. I don't know how many of you know about it. We already have a registered Green Party in India. But green issues are becoming important, whether they call it green or not. Okay, when someone goes and says, I am going to give you agricultural insurance, and at a 2.5% premium, he is talking about climate change, whether he or she is calling it climate change or not. Okay, it's at the end of the day, it's about the name tag. Okay, as Sarath said, if you want to do water, you have to give a proposal saying climate adaptation. It's all about name tag right now. But whether we recognize it or not, some of the green issues are becoming mainstream. Are they sufficient? The answer is no. We need to do much more. That's where group like this, discussion like this, institution like Prayas and others are very, very important to increase public consciousness on green issues. That green is actually this green. Environment is development. Okay, both greens are same. Green is not topi wala and jhola wala.
Right.
Okay, green is also suit boot. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce.
Thanks, Ashok. On the 2 degrees, in the context of the IPCC, there was in this last round of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, there was a struggle where some countries were sort of pushing this line that we have to keep focused on mitigation. Others were saying, look, we have to take adaptation seriously because it's going to be more than 2 degrees. And really the compromise language, which I think makes sense, is this, that we have to do some mitigation because we can't adapt to a 6-degree world. But we have to focus on adaptation because mitigation isn't going to get us to 1.5 degrees. So we do have both these things. And the kinds of things we have to do then for 2 degrees, and it comes back to sort of the opportunity language a little bit, is on the adaptation side also there's a lot of things that we should have been doing anyway from a sustainability point of view. So for example, there's a long movement around rain-fed agriculture, around going back to traditional varieties of crops. Now traditional varieties of crops tend to be much more resilient than single hybrid varieties. So you might not have as high a peak in your total production, but spread across years, your average yield is going to be higher. It's more resilient to spikes in weather. That's the kind of cropping pattern you want to have in a climate change world. So we've been talking about this, activists in the agriculture world have been talking about this for a while anyway, and it turns out the things they've been saying also make sense from a climate adaptation point of view. So we need to be moving down that road as much as possible. On the US elections, the whole, as CB quite correctly said, one of the constraints was really around of negotiating Paris was so that the US Congress didn't have to ratify this. Now there's going to be a domestic discussion around this, and the argument that the US has put forward, the US NGOs, is, listen, we've taken on procedural requirements, there is no substantive requirement, including no requirement that we meet our pledge. In fact, that is how the whole thing is constructed. There is no legal requirement that we meet that pledge, but there is a requirement to put that pledge on the table, and then you have a naming and shaming kind of process that goes with it, right? So again, it's the procedures that are legally binding. And the reason it doesn't make sense to have the pledge legally binding is because what you found with Kyoto is there's no real way of enforcing that, right? So the argument is have a system where countries can stretch a little bit rather than giving them a system where there's a supposed danda waiting and making them basically then have a very conservative pledge. So this is just a long way of saying that the US may not in fact have to ratify this. And with regard to the elections, the story that is told among US NGOs is that the dynamics of the energy and the electric sector in the US are moving in the direction certainly of more gas, just because they've got lucky with that, but also more renewables and less coal for various other reasons that have nothing to do with climate change. And so they are relatively optimistic that we're going to move in this direction anyway, and that there will be workarounds around this. Now again, we'll have to wait and see if that is in fact the case. On energy, I think the less interesting question is whether we're going to be 100% RE, and more interesting question is what is our transition pathway? Are we going to go to 100% RE through a doubling or tripling of coal, or are we going to go through it through a 30% increase in coal? It is the transition story that is really interesting and important in India, and that's what we have to figure out, and we haven't figured it out very well. On the green politics, I'm going to agree with CB and say it slightly differently with a quote from Ram Guha. It was when I was a student, I read this book where he said, environmentalism in India isn't about productive versus protective use of resources. It's about alternative productive uses of resources. Yeah. I think that sort of formulation makes sense to me. There are alternative productive ways of using natural resources, and that's what we need to be talking about.
Well, I'll just, given that the ghanti baj gayi already, so I'll just sort of focus on this last question about the transition, not the energy transition, but this transition in our minds. I mean, I think all of us will agree that here in this room we are speaking, all of us are speaking to sort of the converted. We really come here because we are all interested in similar questions and therefore coming at it from a certain level of concern on the question of sustainability, perhaps on the question of equity, and on the question of meaningful development, sustainable development, and so on. So I think the biggest challenge for us is indeed to make that this conversation the conversation. And that challenge, I don't have any formula for obviously making that happen. None of us here have that. But I think it means obviously spreading horizontally first of all. I mean, I think we are still a very minuscule fraction. Certainly in a happening city like India, I was driving down from the airport, listening to the chatter on the FM radios that you have these days, and the kind of stuff that is going on, whether it's the FM radio in Bangalore, in half Kannada, half English, or Marathi English here, it's that chatter is completely out of touch with what we are talking about here. So I think we have a huge challenge in front of us to work horizontally. I mean, I can certainly, take this opportunity to bash bureaucrats, which is sort of bashing upwards, which is very convenient. But really, that question of working sideways in our own lives, in our own societies, on our own resident welfare associations, or our own colleges, where is even the concern reflected in what's happening in our colleges? How can we have, certainly for this transition to happen, you need 1,000 more Prayases, you need 1,000 more Center for Science and Environment, CPRs, ATRI. We need these replicated all across the country at, as Chandrabhushan rightly said, at the very local level, not in Delhi. And if that is to happen, where are the people to make that transition happen? How do we attract them to this conversation? I think we all need to really work on that, which means then again reflecting on our own lifestyles, on our own questions. Have we taken sort of very easy ways out of this conundrum by saying, well, I just stopped using maybe the air conditioner for a couple of months last year, and then that's solved my particular personal conundrum. I mean, is that how we are going to get there? I think we have to really challenge ourselves deeply. And again, I would like to close with a reference to Girish, because Girish was not only for me somebody who worked on these issues, but at his personal level, in his personal lifestyle, tried enormously hard to internalize and practice what he preached. And I think this is something that we need to constantly be reflecting on. It's not an easy game. It's not something that we can, because there are many structural constraints. I mean, if I want to take public transport just from the airport to this venue, it would take me 2 hours as against 30 minutes or something like that. So, but how do we then get around this problem? How do we work both individually and collectively to create those structures, which are really structures of our mind? I think we have to think about it that way. Why is it that our engineering colleges, our medical colleges, or the vast majority of students coming out of our schools and colleges are focused on something completely different, and not recognizing these linkages, these fundamental things that are the basis of our very life? It's again, as Noroz rightly put, it is not about getting rich first and then going and buying binoculars and watching the tigers in Nagarhole or in Rajaji National Park or Corbett. That's not the environmentalism that we are talking about. But because in getting rich and buying those binoculars, we've already destroyed the environment and probably half the tiger population. So that's really the challenge that we need to be understanding. The message from the First Citizens Report keeps resonating every time we discuss these issues. And I think that's, we need to confront that head on in our personal lives, in our horizontal lives, as much as in our confrontation or engagement with the state. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.